Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. I'm reading today from Tenzin Palmo. Just a few dates before I begin. She was born in England in 1943. Around the age of 18, she decided that she was a Buddhist. At the age of 20, she traveled to Dalhousie in India to help with a Tibetan Buddhist center. She took her first ordination in 1964, and then the second in 1967, and took in the Tibetan tradition. She couldn't become a Bhiksuni, but she went to Hong Kong, and I think it was Hong Kong, 1973, and took Bhiksuni ordination. I'm starting with a paragraph about when she met her teacher. I knew we had been waiting for some Lama. She's in Dalhousie in India. I knew we had been waiting for some Lama for whom we had rented a small house. We were expecting him to come for the summer. I said, "He's a Kagyupa?" She said, "Yes." And I said, "So I can take refuge with him?" And she being Frida, her friend there. And she said, yes, he's a wonderful Lama. When he comes, you must ask him." This was the beginning of May. We waited all through May. We waited all through June. On the last day of June, my 21st birthday, there was a Lama giving a long life initiation because it was full moon day. The telephone rang and Frida Bedi answered it. When she put down the phone, she said, "Your best birthday present has just arrived down at the bus station." I was terrified. My Lama had come at last. I ran back to the nunnery and changed into a long Tibetan dress and got a kata, a long white offering scarf. Then I ran back to the house we had rented to tell them Rinpoche was coming and to get it prepared. By the time I got back to the school, he was already there. I remember how I crawled into the room. I was too terrified to look at him. I had no idea what he was like. I'd never even seen a photograph. Was he old? Was he young? Was he fat? Was he thin? I had no idea. All I saw was the bottom of his robe and his brown shoes. I prostrated to these brown shoes and then sat down. Frida Bedi was saying, "This is so-and-so, and she's a member of the Buddhist Society." Then I said to her, "Tell him I want to take refuge." So she said, "Oh yes, and she would like to take refuge with you." Rinpoche said, "Of course," in this voice which seemed to be saying, "Of course she wants to take refuge. What else could she want to do?" When I heard him say "of course" in that voice, I looked up and saw him for the first time. As I looked at him, it seemed as though two things were happening simultaneously. There was a sense of recognition, like meeting an old friend you haven't seen for a long time. At the same time, it was as if the very deepest thing inside me had suddenly taken an external form. This is chapter 11 in Cave in the Snow, page 111. The scenery outside her cave may have been awesome, but what of Tenzin Palmo's inner world? This, after all, was what she had gone to the cave to discover. What was she seeing on that long journey inwards? Was she sitting there having visions? Was she being bathed in golden light, hearing celestial voices, experiencing waves of transcendental bliss? Or was she perhaps being tormented by the devils of her psyche, disturbed from the depths of her subconscious by those penetrating tools of meditation designed to dig deep beneath the surface? According to the legends of solitary meditators, this was what cave dwelling was about. Up in his icy, barren cave, the great yogi Milarepa, founder of Tenzin Palmo's lineage, after years of terrible deprivation and unwavering endeavour, found himself in a realm of surreal splendour. The walls and floor of his cave melted with the imprint of his hands, feet, buttocks, where he pressed them into the rock. His emaciated body, turned green from eating only nettle soup, was filled with intense ecstasy. In his dreams, he could turn his body into any shape he wished, traversing the universe in any direction unimpeded. In his waking state, he learnt to fly, crossing the valleys of his homeland at great speed, much to the consternation of the farmers ploughing the fields in the valley below. Was the fishmonger's daughter from Bethnal Green experiencing any of this? No one will exactly know what Tenzin Palmo went through in all those years of solitary retreat. The moments of dazzling insight she might have had, the times of darkness she may have endured. She had learnt well from the Togdens, these humble yogis whose qualities had touched her so deeply that one never reveals, let alone boasts, of one's spiritual prowess. Getting rid of the ego, not enhancing it, was the name of the game. Besides, her tantric vows forbade her to divulge any progress she may have made. It was a long-held tradition ever since the Buddha himself had defrocked a monk for performing a miracle in public, declaring the transformation of the human heart was the only miracle that really counted. Frankly, I don't like discussing it. It's like your sexual experiences. Some people like talking about them, others don't. Personally, I find it terribly intimate, she said. When pressed, she conceded the barest essentials. Of course, when you do prolonged retreats, you are going to have experiences of great intensity, times when your body completely melts away or when you feel the body is flying. You get states of incredible awareness and clarity when everything becomes very vivid. There were visions too, occasionally when her guru, Khamtrul Rinpoche, appeared to her to advise her on her meditations. Other holy beings manifested in her cave as well. But these signs, normally taken as indications of supreme spiritual accomplishment, she dismissed as events of little significance. The whole point is not to get visions, but to get realizations, she said sharply, referring to the stage when a truth stops becoming a mental or intellectual construct and becomes real. Only when the meditation dropped from the head to the heart and was felt could transformation begin to take place. And realizations are quite bare, she continued. They are not accompanied by lights and music. We're trying to see things as they really are. A realization is non-conceptual. It's not a product of the thinking process or the emotions, unlike visions which come from that level. A realization is the white, transparent light at the center of the prism, not the rainbow colors around it. As for the bliss, that most attractive of all meditation states, did Tenzin Palmo know this? To the average layperson sitting at home in her house reading about the heroic meditators, it was the bliss that made it all worthwhile. All the terrible hardships and deprivations, the lack of comfort and human companionship, bliss, in short, was a reward. Certainly, the one or two photographs taken of Tenzin Palmo at this time showed a face suffused with happiness. There are states of incredible bliss. Bliss is the fuel of retreat, she confirmed in her matter-of-fact voice. You can't do any long-term practice seriously unless there is inner joy, because the joy and enthusiasm is what carries you along. It's like anything. If you don't really like it, you will have this inner resistance, and everything is going to be very slow. This is why the Buddha named joy as a main factor on the path. The only problem with bliss is that because it arouses such enormous pleasure, beyond anything on a worldly level, including sexual bliss, people cling to it and really want it, and then it becomes another obstacle, she added, before launching on a story to illustrate her point. Once I was with the Togdens in Dalhousie. There were two monks who were training to be yogis. One day they were standing outside shaking a blanket, and they were so blissed out they could hardly stand up. You could actually feel these waves of bliss hitting you. The Togdens turned to me and said, "You know, when you start, this is what happens. You get completely overwhelmed by bliss and you don't know what to do. After a while, you learn how to control it and bring it down to manageable levels. And it's true. When you meet more mature practitioners, they're not completely speechless with all this great bliss because they've learned how to deal with it. And of course, they see into its empty nature. You see, bliss in itself is useless, she continued. It's only useful when it is used as a state of mind for understanding emptiness, when that blissful mind is able to look into its own nature. Otherwise, it is just another subject of samsara. You can understand emptiness on one level, but to understand it on a very subtle level takes this complement of bliss. The blissful mind is a very subtle mind, and that kind of mind looking at emptiness is a very different thing from the gross mind looking at emptiness, and that is why one cultivates bliss. You go through bliss, it marks just a stage on the journey. The ultimate goal is to realize the nature of the mind, she insisted. The nature of the mind, she said, was unconditioned, non-dual consciousness. It was emptiness and bliss. It was the state of knowing without the knower. And when it was realized, it wasn't very dramatic at all. There was no cosmic explosion, no fanfare of celestial trumpets. It's like waking up for the first time, surfacing out of a dream, and then realize that you have been dreaming. That is why the sages talk about all things being an illusion. Our normal way of being is muffled. It's not vivid. It's like breathing in stale air. Waking up is not sensational. It's ordinary, but it's extremely real. Nor apparently does the real thing happen in a big bang. At first you get a glimpse of it. That is actually only the beginning of the path. People often think when they get that glimpse that it is the whole thing, that they've reached the goal. Once you begin to see the nature of the mind, then you can begin to meditate. Then after that, you have to stabilize it until the nature of the mind becomes more and more familiar. And when that is done, you integrate it into everyday life. At other times, Tenzin Palmo's revelations were decidedly more ordinary, although in her eyes extremely valuable. There was the occasion one spring when the thaw of the winter snows had begun and her cave was systematically flooded. The wall and floors were getting wetter and wetter, and for some reason I was also not very well. I was beginning to think, oh dear, what they say about caves is really true, and started to feel very down. Suddenly, the Buddha's first noble truth, which she had learned when she first encountered Buddhism, struck her with renewed force. I thought, why are you still looking for happiness in samsara? And my mind just changed around. It was like, that's right, samsara is dukkha. It's okay that it's snowing. It's okay that I'm sick because that is the nature of samsara. There's nothing to worry about. If it goes well, that's nice. And if it doesn't go well, that's also nice. It doesn't make any difference. Although it sounds very elementary, at the time it was quite a breakthrough. Since then, I have never really cared about external circumstances. In that way, the cave was a great teaching because it was not too perfect. If the results of meditation could be sensational, the path to enlightenment was plodding and exceedingly hard work. There was a lot to do and an inconceivably long way to go. The lamas said if you reached there in 3 lifetimes, you were moving incredibly quickly. For the task at hand was the transformation of the body, speech, and mind into that of a Buddha, no less. Understanding this, the Tibetans have developed the way into a science. Anyone could do it, given the texts which held the instructions, the initiations which conferred the empowerment, and the right motivation which ensured the seeker did not fall into the abyss of self-interest. There were clear-cut paths to take, detailed directions to follow, delineated levels to reach, each marked with their own characteristics, so that you knew precisely where you were. There were specific landmarks to watch out for, special yogic exercises to do, and a myriad aids harnessing all the senses to propel the seeker forward. This was the mind working on the mind, consciousness working on consciousness, the task at hand unlocking the secrets of that 3-pound universe contained within our own heads. In short, what Tenzin Palmo was engaging in was arguably the most important and significant adventure of all time, the exploration of inner space. Dr. Thurman, professor of Indo-Tibetan Studies at Columbia University, one of the world's most lucid and entertaining exponents of Buddhism, put it this way: what the meditator is doing in those long retreats is a very technical thing. He's not just sitting there communing with the great oneness. He's technically going down, pulling apart his own nervous system to become self-aware from out of his own cells. It's like you are using word perfect and you are in the chip, and you are self-aware of being in the chip. The way you have done that is by stabilizing your mind, where you can go down to the dots and dashes, and you've gone down and down even into that. In other words, the Mahayana Buddhist, filled with the technical understanding of Tantra, has become a quantum physicist of inner reality. What he has done is disidentified from the coarse conceptual and perceptual process. He's gone down to the neuronal level. And from inside that level, he's gone down to the most subtle or supra-neuronal level. And he's become where it is like the computer is self-consciously aware of itself. The yogi goes right down to below the machine language, below the subatomic level. When you have done this, what you have achieved is not some kind of mystical thing, but some very concrete evolutionary thing. It's the highest level of evolution. That's what the Buddha is defined as. Personally, Tenzin Palmo had never doubted the efficacy of the method she was following. Tibet has been producing enlightened beings like an assembly line for centuries. For such a small population, it was extraordinary. Being a methodical and highly conscientious person, she had started at the beginning with the preliminary practices, which she had begun in Dalhousie and Nahal, long before she went into the cave. These consisted of certain rites such as mandala offerings, where the practitioner builds up a symbolic universe on small silver trays decorated with precious items and offers it to all the Buddhas, or doing full-length prostrations or mantra recitation. These are then performed literally hundreds of thousands of times in order to prepare and soften the mind for the esoteric tantric meditations that were to follow. In the cave, Tenzin Palmo did them all again. At one point she fasted completely, although she would not reveal for how long. At another, she conducted a partial fast while simultaneously doing prostrations and singing praises to Chenrezig, the 1,000-armed Buddha of compassion. Always an extremely arduous exercise, both physically and mentally. This time it was made even more difficult by the extreme conditions in which she was living. It was winter and I didn't have the right food. What I was eating was too heavy. When you fast, it's much better if you have light, nourishing food. So physically, it was quite tough. I got digestive problems and became very weak. Mentally, however, it worked. The mind does become purified. The prayers are very beautiful and the mind grows extremely clear and light, very devoted and open. After she had done 6 months of purification practice, Tenzin Palmo had a dream. I was in a prison, a vast prison composed of many different levels. On the top floor, people were living in luxury, in penthouse-type splendor, while in the basement, others were undergoing terrible torture. In the immediate floors, the rest of the inhabitants were engaged in various activities in diverse conditions. Suddenly I realized that no matter what level people were on, we were all, nevertheless, trapped in a prison. With that, I found a boat and decided to escape, taking as many people as I could with me. I went all over the prison telling people of their predicament and urging them to break free. But no matter how hard I tried, they all seemed to be locked into an awful inertia. And in the end, only 2 people had the will and the courage to come with me. We got into the boat, and even though there were prison guards around, nobody stopped us as we sailed out of the prison to the world outside. Once we were there, we started to run alongside the prison. As I looked over at it, I could still see all the people in the windows, busily engaged in their different activities, not the least concerned about the truth of their situation. We ran for miles and miles on a path parallel to the prison, which seemed never-ending. I became increasingly exhausted and dispirited. I felt I was never going to get beyond the prison and that we might as well return and go back in. I was about to give up when I realized that the two other people who had followed me had their hopes pinned on me, and that if I gave up, they would be doomed as well. I couldn't let them down, so I kept going. Immediately we came to a T-junction, beyond which was a completely different landscape. It was like suburbia. There were these neat houses with flowery borders and trees. We came to the first house and knocked at the door. A nice middle-aged woman opened it, looked at us and said, "Oh, you've come from that place. Not many people get out. You'll be okay now, but you must change your clothes. To go back would be dangerous, but you must try to help others to get out." At that point, I had a great surge of aspiration. "I have tried, but no one wants to come," I told the woman. She replied, "Those in power will be helping you." At that, I said, "I dedicate myself to working with them so that I can help free all beings." I woke up at that point, Tenzin Palmo said, and giggled at the image of the middle-aged lady in suburbia. The dream was clear. In her subconscious, Tenzin Palmo had pledged herself to lead the great escape out of the prison of samsara, the realms of suffering existence we're condemned to, until we reach the eternal freedom of enlightenment. She had also internalized, it seemed, the bodhisattva ideal of unconditioned altruism. When she was not doing her preliminary practices, she worked on her single-pointed concentration, the meditative discipline which trains the mind to focus single-pointedly on one subject without interruption. Yogis were said to be able to stay in this state for days, weeks, months, without moving, their mind totally absorbed on the wonders of their inner reality. Single-pointed concentration, or samadhi, was essential for penetrating the nature of reality and discovering absolute truth. It was also exceedingly difficult, the mind habitually wanting to dance all over the place, flitting from one random thought to another, from fantasy to fantasy, perpetually chattering away to itself, expending vast quantities of energy in an endless stream of trivia. The mind was like a wild horse, they said, that needed to be reined in and trained. When the mind's energy was harnessed and channeled like a laser beam on a single subject, its power was said to be tremendous. Ultimately, this was the high-voltage power tool needed to dig down into the farthest reaches of the mind, unlocking the greatest treasures buried there. For any practice to work, said Tenzin, the mind which is meditating and the object of meditation must merge. Often they are facing each other. One has to become completely absorbed, then the transformation will occur. The awareness naturally drops from the head to the heart, and when that happens, the heart opens, and there is no I. And that is the relief. When one can learn to live from that center rather than up in the head, whatever one does is spontaneous and appropriate. It also immediately releases a great flow of energy because it is not at all obstructed, as it usually is, by our own intervention. One becomes more joyful and light in both senses of the word. Because it's going back to the source, the heart, rather than being in exile in the head. Our modern scientific approach has thrown such emphasis on the brain, we're also cut off. That is why so many people feel life is meaningless and sterile. When she had finished all her preparations, she got down to the core of her practice, Tantra, the alchemical process which promised the transformation to full awakening. If the end result was magical, the business of getting there was infinitely prosaic, and some would say horribly tedious. Every day for months and years, she was in formal retreat inside her cave. She got into her meditation box and followed the same grueling, utterly repetitive routine. Up at 3 a.m. for the first 3-hour meditation session, 6 a.m. breakfast, 8 a.m. back into the box for the second 3-hour meditation session, 11 a.m. lunch and a break, 3 p.m. return to the box for the third 3-hour meditation, 6 p.m. tea, 7 p.m. the fourth 3-hour session, 10 p.m. bed in the meditation box. All in all, that amounted to 12 hours of meditation a day, day in, day out, for weeks, months, and years on end. Ironically, for a woman who had left the world, she had a clock to time all her sessions and was living a life as disciplined and structured as any worker on the factory floor. For all the mind-numbing monotony, she was never bored. Sometimes I would think that if I were having to watch the same television program 4 times a day, I'd have gone up the wall. But in retreat, there's a pattern that emerges. At first, it is very interesting. Then you hit a period where it's excruciatingly boring. Then you get a second wind, after which it becomes more and more fascinating, until at the end it's much more fascinating and interesting than it was in the beginning. That's how it is, even if you're doing the same thing 4 times a day for 3 years. It's because the material begins to open up its real meaning, and you discover level after level of inner significance. So at the end, you are much more involved in it and totally identified with it than you were at the beginning. She remained deliberately vague about the precise nature of the material she was working with. I was doing very old traditional practices ascribed to the Buddha himself. He revealed them to various great masters who wrote them down after having realized them for themselves. They involve a lot of visualization and internal yogic practices. Basically, you use the creative, imaginative faculty of the mind to transform everything, both internally and externally. The creative imagination in itself is an incredibly powerful force. If you channel it in the right way, it can reach very deep levels of the mind, which can't be accessed through verbal means or mere analysis. This is because on a very deep level, we think in pictures. If you are using pictures which have arisen in an enlightened mind, somehow that unlocks very deep levels in our own minds. What you are dealing with are images which are a reflection of the deepest qualities within oneself. They are reflections of one's Buddha mind, therefore they are a skillful means of leading you back to who one really is. That's why when you practice, things occur and experiences happen. Maybe it was her Cockney upbringing which taught her to be cheerful in adversity and gave her resilience. Maybe it was her psychological makeup, which was unusually well-balanced and unneurotic. Or perhaps it was that for some reason she was predisposed to be up in the mountains meditating alone. But Tenzin Palmo claims that for her there was no dark night of the soul. There was never a moment when the legendary demons, confronted by other recluses, rose up to torment and taunt. She suffered no moments of madness, no paranoia, no agonizing periods of doubt or depression, and not a second was she prey to the barbs of lust that seemed to attack the most holy of male hermits. None of this happened to Tenzin Palmo. I didn't encounter anything that was particularly awful. Maybe because I didn't have a traumatic childhood. I was very lucky in that respect. While she may not have hit the spiritual wall in any dramatic fashion, she claims she did not get off scot-free. The pitfalls were there, lethal just the same. It was inevitable. With no social life to distract her, no roles to fulfill, no other person to deflect her feelings onto, the masks all fell away. Now the mirror was held up to herself. It was not always a comfortable sight. In retreat, you see your nature in the raw, and you have to deal with it. I may not have had heavy negative karma, but that does not mean my problems don't exist. They're just not so transparent and therefore more difficult to catch. She elaborated, when you get into the practice, you begin to see how it should be done. And when it is not, you begin to ask yourself why. In my case, it came down to laziness, a fundamental inertia. That's my main problem. It's tricky. It's not like facing the tigers and wolves of anger and desire. These sorts of problems you can grapple with. My failings are much more insidious. They hide in the undergrowth, so they are much more difficult to see. The laziness she was referring to was not the idleness of sitting around doing nothing, of being slothful, of engaging in frivolous tasks. Tenzin Palmo could never be accused of that. It was indeed a laziness of much more subtle kind. One knows how to practice, and of that one is perfectly capable, but one settles for second or third best. It's like getting the progress prize at school. One is not really doing one's best. It's a very low grade of effort, and it is much more serious than having a bad temper. The times when I have genuinely put my whole self into something, the results have surprised even me. Inside her cave, she was doing more than just sit in the box. In her break, she painted beautiful pictures of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. She copied out texts for her monastery in the elegant calligraphy that she had taught herself. And as she had done all her life, she read prolifically and deeply all the work she could get her hands on about the Buddha and about the teachings, including works belonging to other traditions. It was highly unusual. Most Tibetan Buddhists never stepped outside their own literature. That learning was to hold her in good stead later, when she would draw on it time and time again to back up a point she was making. I think it's very important for Westerners who come from such a totally different background to really study the foundations of Buddhism, what the Buddha taught. If you read the very early sutras, the early Theravadan tradition is the foundation for everything which came after it. Without having really understood the foundation, without having really understood what the foundation was, you cannot really appreciate what comes after. As Western Buddhists, I think we have a responsibility to the Buddhist Dharma. Tenzin Palmo may have removed herself from the world, but others were certainly not forgotten. Over the years, she developed lengthy correspondence with a wide variety of people, some of whom she had not seen for years. When she was not in strict retreat, she would faithfully answer all of the letters which were delivered by Tenzin Dorji along with her supplies. Sometimes there were as many as 60, and she looked upon these friendships as treasures in her life. I have met some truly wonderful people, and I am always grateful for that. Her friends, family, and a multitude of sentient beings she did not know were also included in her prayers and meditations. You automatically visualize all beings around you. In that way, they partake of whatever benefits may occur. It was part of her bodhisattva vow, for true enlightenment could not be reached without bringing all living beings to that state. How could one be sincerely happy anyway, knowing countless others were enduring untold miseries throughout every realm of existence? After all those hours of meditating, 12 years of sitting in her box looking inwards, did she improve? Tenzin replied, like anything else, if you practice long enough, it gets easier. For example, if you are learning to play the piano, in the beginning your fingers are very stiff, and you hit many wrong notes, and it's very awkward. But if you continually practice, it gets easier and easier. Even so, although a concert pianist is very skilled at playing, still his difficulties are there. They may be at a higher level and not apparent to other people, but he sees his own problems. She said, modest as always. Why does one go into retreat? One goes into a retreat to understand who one really is and what the situation is. When one begins to understand oneself, then one can truly understand others, because we are all so interrelated. It is very difficult to understand others while one is still caught up in the turmoil of one's own emotional involvement, because we're always interpreting others from the standpoint of our own needs. That's why when you meet hermits who have done a lot of retreat, say 25 years, they are not cold or distant. On the contrary, they are absolutely lovely people. You know that their love for you is totally without judgment, because it doesn't rely on who you are or what you are doing, or how you treat them. It's totally impartial. It's just love. It's like the sun, it shines on everyone. Whatever you did, they'd still love you because they understand your predicament, and in that understanding naturally arises love and compassion. It's not based on sentiment. It's not based on emotion. Sentimental love is very unstable because it's based on feedback and how good it makes you feel. That's not real love at all. In the end, had it all been worth it? After that protracted, extraordinary effort, the hardships, the self-discipline, the renunciation, what had she gained? The answer came back quick as a flash. It's not what you gain, but what you lose. It's like unpeeling the layers of an onion. That's what you have to do. My quest was to understand what perfection meant. Now I realize that on one level, we have never moved away from it. It is only our deluded perception which prevents our seeing what we already have. The more you realize there is nothing to realize. The idea that there's somewhere we have got to get to and something we have to attain is our basic delusion. Who is there to attain it anyway?
Namayang Dhammakataya Sadhu Karanda Dhamma Se Sadhu, Sadhu, Sadhu Anumodami. Questions, comments?
I find a lot of the Tibetan practices and teachings very inspiring and intriguing, but since our tradition, just as one point of comparison, we don't have so many of the visualization practices. I was just wondering if you had any suggestions for how to go about integrating some of those, or have you experimented with any of that, or?
Well, I think one of the things is, in comparison, we are, how do you say, almost poverty-stricken. But it's like taking, in terms of visualizations, usually the visualizations that one uses are around the visualizations of course, of focusing on the Buddha, around Sangha, the aspects of say Devas, Deva realms, and those are it's not really taught very much of in our forest tradition, but it's something that's fairly common in Thai tradition. Also, one of the most common mantras that's used in Thailand is the Jina Banchara, and it's this wonderful visualization of surrounding yourself with the Buddhas and Arahants, and you got, I can't remember, you have Sariputta on this shoulder, and it's just, you're populating your space with all these great beings, and that's a how do you say, like a Theravada visualization, and so that I think one of the things is we're quite influenced by the northeastern forest tradition, which is it's very much conditioned by the temperament of the Northeasterners, who are just, they're very down-to-earth people who just don't get up a whole lot of muss and fuss and just work with the simple things. So it's, to me, it's one of the strengths, really, because it's although there are really skillful tools that can be implemented, it can sometimes be a bit confusing and endless. But that's actually, like, even Tenzin Palmo in her speaking about it. It's really, she cuts through a lot of the extraneous and gets to the heart of it.
Yeah. I'm struck by there's a reference in there to looking back to the old teachings.
Yeah.
And the stark difference between the two, where I don't really, you see the Buddha and his disciples, well, not necessarily Buddha, but the disciples, or the people who achieve liberation, like Sariputta while he's fanning the Buddha, or other people going about things in their daily life. And our monastic rules, the way the Buddha formulates the structure of the training, necessitates that you go into the world on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. And so it seems to me that the mind has an incredible capacity to recognize patterns, and it gets into the subject-object pattern that is the formation of suffering. Mm-hmm. And through the stillness of practice in solitude, it's then impinged by the world, and you develop this idea of, or the Buddha instructs you to develop the idea of looking at the pattern of change, looking at the pattern of fabrication, then you go into the world, and that's why you see liberated people. My own personal experience is the transformative insight occurs in the world, or in relationship to the world, mm-hmm. and not through shutting yourself off. I don't see the value of fabricating mental fabrications when the goal is to transcend mental fabrications.
Yeah, well, yeah, yes and no. I mean, in the sense of I think each. That's why the path is broad enough to hold it, and I think that there is a certain need, if not certainly in terms of, if not physical solitude, then certainly the internal solitude, where one is able to at least step back from that process and to be able to see what's happening. And many times people need that physical stepping back in order to see what the mind is doing, because it's kind of in your face. But it's not essential. But it's certainly, different people respond in different ways. I think even in whether it's in our own practices or certainly in the Tibetan tradition, and they've got a whole range of ways of practices as they approach it. And I think it's not. There's not a. I don't think there's an absolute fixed way. But certainly my own experience is similar, where it's been the practice and then engaging that's been a trigger, a catalyst for insight and for things to fall away. And sometimes it's really hard to figure out what the heck the Tibetans are doing, because they don't, like you read all these great biographies of these masters, and then you finish the book, you realize they didn't say squat about what they were doing. Because it's, so it's hard to sometimes figure out what the heck was the internal workings of the practice. Because there's some, there's certainly in their tradition, it's definitely not, you're not supposed to talk about the practices, especially to somebody who's not initiated. So it's, as you read the biographies, and oftentimes as they say, their lives are inspiring so many people, and you think, what the heck did they do? What was the practice? So that's an interesting kind of piece of it as well. But certainly those aspects of I think, particularly the Kagyus are because their progenitor is Milarepa, so he was this incredible hermit, and so that they put a lot of emphasis on that seeking of solitude, and whereas say the Gelugpas way less so, how long was Tenzin Palmo in her cave?
12 years.
12 years, yeah.
But she spent, maybe the last 30, creating the nunnery and teaching all around the world. And so from that time, she's been an incredible springboard for many, many things.
Oh, yeah. She's been very, very engaged.
Also, even Milarepa and her, they have a lot of training before they enter their solitude period.
Yeah, and that's the... and generally, that's the pattern where one isn't actually even really encouraged to go off into solitude until one's got a pretty solid foundation.
One more, I appreciate the take on some of the bodhisattva ideal that's, at least I think I've heard you speak about it in Ajahn as well, around, for example, the dual roles that the teachings on emptiness play with the teachings on saving all beings, and how they allow for eventually you don't actually have to stick around forever, which seems a bit impractical in some ways, perhaps.
Well, on a logical basis.
Yeah, that too.
It's not a logical conclusion.
And yet I'm also, and certainly reading some of the Tibetan texts about the bodhisattvas, it seems like there might be, some of them actually, when they speak about like Milarepa going into the Dhammakaya, maybe they're actually talking about enlightenment, or something. But at the same time, being in Thailand, you do hear some of the Kruba Ajahns talk about this esoteric side of like Tawating's or to see to heaven, about really powerful beings that are sticking around for a long time, and that you don't really hear about in Jack Kornfield talks so often. But I can't help but be somewhat curious that there are these both sides. One definitely resonates with me as a Westerner, but the other side, I loved as well, and sometimes it seems like maybe they don't need to be totally reconciled. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think, trying to just complicate your mind, trying to reconcile everything. It's just putting the path into practice, and recognizing that one of the main obstacles to liberation is our obsession with ourselves. So that seems a skillful means. It's like a classic Lopasamato quote, every time I think about myself, I feel miserable. I feel depressed. So it's, how do I, what are ways to step beyond that?
Yeah, so what would be like I guess, a good thing to reflect on, as opposed to obsessing about oneself, or, for example, just kind of not thinking or being aware of the body, or just thinking about something else. Or?
Well, one is first is actually seeing the suffering that's involved, and seeing how one is limiting and complicating one's own life and the life of everybody around one by one's own obsession with oneself. So then that's a good way of seeing it, and then finding very practical ways of stepping beyond that, without going to. The ideal of that sometimes used, saving all sentient beings, but you can't get. It's like Braj and Sujita one time sort of saying, it's just, it's hard enough dealing with this arahants in a monastery trying to get somebody to do something, but those bodhisattvas are just a real pain in the butt. These ideals that people sort of they throw around or get obsessed with, and just help out with the dishes, do something.
I remember a guest here many years ago related a story that he was talking to his Zen teacher in the Japanese tradition, saying, "Man, it's sort of like saving all sentient beings. I mean, the other four vows, like I can get it, but like saving all beings, it just seems like way too much. I don't think I can. How do I hold this teaching?" And his Roshi said, "Just add 2 words, from myself." Saving all beings from myself.
That's great.
One more?
Yeah.
There was a little book in the book room, I think it was called Small Book of Chants, and I was kind of flipping through it, I didn't really know what it was. It looked like it was Ajahn Lee, and there were some different things in there, but it looked like one of them, I think he called it the Divine Mantra. It might have been a translation of what you spoke to in response to somebody's question at the beginning. It was some kind of visualization thing, all based on Theravada.
Yeah, that's it.
Is that
the Jina Cut?
That's the Jina Vajrayana.
Yeah, it's in there, and it's in English, yeah. It's great.
Right. But it seemed like he kind of placed some emphasis on it, and maybe even Ajahn Jeff, like when he first went to Thailand, he was practicing.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, I mean, it's probably, in terms of, you're around Thailand, through the whole culture, it's probably the most popular chant that people, I say besides your basic sort of Arahang Samma Sambuddha, your basic chant. But in terms of a mantra that's used as a way of seeing as something that is both settling of the mind and inspirational. It's very common.
So even like Ajahn Lee, I mean, do you know anything about how he approached it in his teaching?
No idea. But I mean, it's if you look at the the actual content of the chant, then you sort of see, oh yeah, this is really taking kind of Theravada imagery and creating that imagery of surrounding oneself with both protective and inspirational beings and support one's aspiration for awakening.
And so the idea with a practice like that, I guess in my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, would be kind of like you're using the constructive or fabricative aspects of the mind to do a wholesome, like kind of basically wholesome mental karma and kind of engage the mind in such a way that kind of brightens it and inspires it.
Yeah, exactly. One's engaging the mind in a way, and especially if you're left with the breath and all you do is get bored and restless and sleepy, then you're finding something to get the mind engaged in a way, so that different people need different tools, and so that's and also different people have different temperaments. I mean, people have like people with a stronger devotional side, just having a way to channel that inspires the mind. So that it's just you're finding ways to engage the mind in a way that it's able to settle and balance. For myself, I'm not particularly visual, so it's never really interested me that much. When I've done visualizations, it's almost always been, well, as is my temperament, just something simple. but either colored light or like bright light, going into light. And I find that really inspiring to the mind. And also, and as well, my mind tends to get busy if I poke it or give it too much to do. It gets really busy really quickly. So just finding something that gives that balance, whereas others will take that and be able to utilize it